Hello students, I am Navdeep Kaur, Assistant Professor, PG Department of English, Cultural Studies and Foreign Languages, Khalsa College, Patiala. Welcome to my class on Robert Browning's Dramatic Monologue. This lecture is based on the use of dramatic monologue in the works of Robert Browning. Now let's begin with biographical details of Robert Browning. Robert Browning was a prominent English poet and playwright of Victorian period. He was born in Walworth, London in 1812. He was the only son of Sarah Anna and Robert Browning Sr. His father was a bank clerk and his mother was devoted and religious lady. Now let's talk about the education of Robert Browning. Robert Browning went to school from 1820 to 1826. After that, he left his school. He was educated at home with the help of tutors. He spent a lot of time in his father's bulky library where he loved to read books of Greek dramatists like Homer. Although Robert Browning started writing poetry quite early when he was just 12 years old, but at that time he did not receive much acclaim. It was only after the publication of his famous poem Pauline that he gained some recognition. Now let's talk about some of the notable works of Robert Browning. So this is the list of the poems of Robert Browning. His notable works include My Last Duchess, Fra Lippo, Sordello, The Pied Piper of Hamelin, Pippa Passes, Rabbi Ben Ezra, and Dramatis Persona. Browning is well known for his 12-book long poem titled The Ring and the Book. Name of the poem is The Ring and the Book. Now let's know more about the style of writing poetry. Robert Browning's style of poetry. He wrote lyrical poetry as well as the dramatic poetry. Some of his poems were based on the philosophy and attitude towards human life, but his most famous poetic style is dramatic monologue. Dramatic monologue is the most famous style due to which he gained much recognition. Robert Browning is well acclaimed for the use of dramatic monologue in his poetry, although he wrote in many styles and poetic techniques, but he was quite famous for his monologues only. Now, the term dramatic monologue was used for the first time by G.W. Thornbury in a collection of poems published in 1857. The term dramatic monologue was applied to Browning's poetry for the very first time by William Stigand. It means Robert Browning doesn't use the term dramatic monologue for his poems. This term was initially used by someone else. Later on, Browning's poems were famous as dramatic monologues. Browning himself described his poems as dramatic lyrics. As W.C. Devan in his book titled A Browning Handbook remarks that though for the most part lyric in expression, always dramatic in principle, and the utterance of imaginary person, not mine. It means he himself said this thing, that his poems are mostly dramatic in principle. Now, before discussing the use of this poetic technique of dramatic monologue in the poetry of Robert Browning, let's first understand this technique, that what do we really mean by this term dramatic monologue. A dramatic monologue is a kind of poem in which the speaker gives expression to his thoughts in the presence of a second person, with the purpose of convincing him of his beliefs and convictions. Dramatic monologue can be in the form of a speech or a narrative by any imaginary person who is not the poet himself. I repeat, I emphasize on this point that the speaker is not the poet himself. This kind of poem is dramatic as it has a theatrical quality. Dramatic monologue includes the utterance of a single speaker. It includes the utterance of one solitary speaker. It means that there is a single speaker. This utterance is meant for an audience, but no dialogue is coming from any other character or characters. It means they do not speak at all. They are the listeners only. In this poem, there is an imagined speaker who addresses a silent listener. The speech in the poem reveals the speaker's character. Now let's talk about the difference between dramatic monologue and soliloquy, that how dramatic monologue is different from the term soliloquy. In a soliloquy, the speaker delivers his own thought aloud without being interrupted and disturbed by any other person. It generally refers or includes a kind of a speech by a character when he is all alone. On the other hand, in dramatic monologue, there is always a presence of second person to whom the thoughts of the speaker are presented. But the second person or the listener cannot interrupt the main speaker. So, this is the difference between dramatic monologue and soliloquy. Now, let's examine some of the salient characteristics of Robert Browning's dramatic monologue. The first and the foremost feature characteristic of Browning's dramatic monologue is that it consists of a speaker and a listener. That it consists of a speaker and a listener. The reader receives information about the protagonist, about the audience, and also about the scene through the words of the speaker himself. The reader gets all the information from the speaker, and he or she sees what the speaker sees. This enables the reader to identify with the speaker and also to understand the speaker's point of view in the poem. The listener can only listen to what is being said in the utterance of the speaker. Then comes the topic or subject matter of Browning's dramatic monologue. This is another feature of his dramatic monologue. Browning's monologues are usually they are based on art, religion, love, philosophy, adultery, life, death, morality, etc. The topics of Browning's poems are concerned with the opposing ideologies of Victorian times like faith and doubt, religion and science, good and evil, etc. Now let's have an idea about the characters of Browning's dramatic monologue. Browning portrays a wide variety of characters, usually drawn from all classes of life, like scholars, musicians, painters, dukes, murderers, lovers, etc. The characters in Browning's poems reveal themselves in their monologues and bring out the inner working of their minds. But most of the characters of his monologues do not reveal the full truth. They do not reveal the full reality of their lives in their speeches. Sometimes they reveal their own follies, they reveal their own weaknesses and shortcomings in their speeches. Now let's talk about Browning's language. The language used by Robert Browning in his monologues. Browning's language is highly colloquial and disharmonious. Sometimes they have elements of violence and vividness also. Some of his monologues are characterized by excessive usage of punctuation marks like question mark, exclamatory sign, inverted commas, semicolon, hyphen, etc. So these are the salient characteristics of Robert Browning's dramatic monologue. So these are the examples of Browning's dramatic monologue. My Last Duchess, Porphyrias Lover, Fra Lippo, The Ring and the Book, Andrea del Sarto, The Last Ride Together. So these are some of the famous Robert Browning's dramatic monologues. Now let's begin the discussion of the poems of Browning's monologues with his most famous poem, My Last Duchess. My Last Duchess is Browning's most famous dramatic monologue. In this poem, Duke of Ferrara is the speaker who is talking to an acquaintance who is the listener in the poem, and this acquaintance is an envoy of a powerful man. The Duke reveals a painting of his late wife, whom he refers to as the Last Duchess, and then he starts talking about her. He then starts talking about the habits, the likings and dislikings of his wife, of his late wife, Duchess. He explains to his guest that what has happened to her. She smiled and blushed too much at other men, as she did not appreciate his kindness to her enough. So because of this disrespectful behavior, measures had been taken, and now the Duke is searching for a new wife. The portrayal of the Duchess in the Duke's words is also an important part of the poem, but the main goal of this poem, My Last Duchess, is the exploration of the mind of the speaker. He does not gain any self-knowledge by the end of the poem. He blames others for their mistakes to disguise his own. The Duke avoids self-examination and refuses to look at his own faults or even admit that he has faults. The Duke likes to exhibit his power to the envoy, who, of course, will have to tell his master that what kind of person his future son-in-law is. At the end of the poem, there is a striking image of Neptune, the Roman god of the sea, a taming seahorse, which is a symbol for the woman who is being objectified and controlled. Neptune, of course, stands for the Duke. This image serves as the warning for the next Duchess that the Duke shows to the envoy that his next wife has to obey him and he will not tolerate her behavior, her loose behavior rather. So my Last Duchess is considered as a perfect example, specimen of dramatic monologue. It comprises all the 7 characteristics of dramatic monologue. The speaker here is the Duke. The audience consists of a man, the envoy of the father of the possible next Duchess, and the main character reveals himself and his personality by his peculiar speech. And there is also a dramatic action in the poem. And finally, the action is taking place in the present. So this is all about Robert Browning's poem, My Last Duchess. Now, let's have an idea of Browning's another dramatic monologue titled Porphyrias Lover. Porphyrias Lover is also one of the famous dramatic monologues of Robert Browning. In this poem, speaker is the lover. He describes the stormy situation outside and then he also describes his beloved named Porphyria when she enters the cottage and his actions. There is not an audience in the poem itself. He does not address the only person who is present there, that is Porphyria. He speaks in her name and gives an account of the situation. He explains his thoughts and reasoning to the reader, who are clearly not those of a sane person. The reader realizes that he or she is dealing with an unreliable speaker. And the lover here wants to preserve the love of the beloved for him forever. So he killed her brutally by strangling her with her own hair. So in this poem, the speaker, the lover, killed his own beloved. The speaker does not mention any kind of struggle or resistance when he puts Porphyria's hair around her neck and tightens it. Of course, the speaker here is an unreliable person. She may have resisted him, but she was in a vulnerable position and she was unable to go against the force of her lover. The speaker here has found a solution for his problem, keeping their love untouched and untroubled by other people or the difference in the classes. The only way to solve the problem of the speaker here is to kill his beloved Porphyria. So this is about the poem Porphyria's Lover. Now, let's talk about the next poem, Fra Lippo Lippi. Fra Lippo Lippi is again a famous dramatic monologue written by Browning in 1855. The narrator of the poem, named Lippo Lippi, was a famous painter and monk who is caught by police officials in this poem. He begins to tell his life story to those officials. In this poem, Browning got inspiration of writing such a poem when he read about Lippo Lippi in Vasari's work Lives of the Artists. Browning believed that art should have a moral purpose and an artist should have a responsibility to portray realistic picture of life. So this is brief description of Browning's poem Fra Lippo Lippi. Then comes another monologue titled The Ring and the Book. So The Ring and the Book is an epic length poem of 21,000 lines. The poem was published in 4 installments in the years 1868 to 1869. This poem is based on the documents from a Roman murder trial of 1698. So this is 12-book poem, out of which 10 are dramatic monologues. So this poem gives the narrator's varied perspectives on the case of that murder trial of 1698. So this is about the poem The Ring and the Book. Next comes Andrea del Sarto. Andrea del Sarto is a dramatic monologue about a painter of the Renaissance period. Andrea del Sarto is not a fictitious character, but an actual person who was a painter during that art movement. His paintings depicted religious scenes. He came to serve the King of France as court painter, but after some time what happened? He left France and he never came back. He had kept the money which he was supposed to buy paintings and spent all of it on a house and on his wife Lucrezia. This poem is a long dramatic monologue addressed to Lucrezia, who does not pay attention to what he is trying to tell her. Instead, she waits for her lover. In this monologue, he particularly talks about his past achievements and his painting skills. He states that he is the better painter when compared to Michelangelo and Raphael. So he is comparing his artistic work with other painters. So the protagonist here, Andrea del Sarto, is a failed hero and artist, as he cannot devote himself to his profession completely, although he wanted to do so, but the circumstances are not allowing him to do this. So this is about the dramatic monologue Andrea del Sarto. Now, The Last Ride Together, another beautiful dramatic monologue written by Browning. So this is a dramatic monologue in which the lover is addressing to his beloved who is about to leave him forever. So he requests her to have just a last ride with him. The speaker wants to keep the memories with him as a possession forever. The poem is optimistic in outlook towards the end, as the speaker emphasizes on the word together rather than on the word last. So, dramatic monologue was a popular form of poetry in Browning's times. In his monologues, every detail of the setting contributes to the effect. Browning's three objects in writing a dramatic monologue are presentation of plot, character, and scene in a speech of a single person. Although Browning did not invent this form of poetry, but he made it specially his own. Almost all his dramatic monologues show his passionate appreciation of the things seen and his sympathy with a condition of mind. So, Browning's philosophy of life is beautifully reflected in these dramatic monologues. So, this is all about the characteristics of Browning's dramatic monologues. Thank you so much for watching this presentation.